quelques bâtiments avant de se disperser à 4 heures ce matin. Ces émeutes font suite à la bavure d'un des inspecteurs du commissariat des Muguets. Il y a 2 jours, il avait sévèrement blessé un jeune de la cité pendant une garde à vue.
The makeup of what are considered minority groups in France come from, well, the considerable majority of that minority come from African countries. The most visible are across North Africa, so countries like Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, but then sub-Saharan Africa also, Mali, Senegal. It's, a huge proportion are francophone. France and former colonies of France, some would argue they continue to be extensions of the legacies of French imperialism, and particularly in recent months where there have been numerous military coups in countries like Niger and Gabon, this question of the continued imperial presence of France, its exploitation of resources, labor, etc., within those nations, the impacts of which also causes people to flee in dangerous and desperate ways, has resurfaced. And it has also led to protests opposing the continued presence of France, military and otherwise. And it's also reinforced the point that Seven London made, which is we are here because you were there. And certainly France continues to be there.
One thing I like to say about the question of minorities in France or ethnic minorities in France is to first realize that France, despite sort of the way it sort of sells itself, if you will, has a very long history of migration, of immigration, primarily from former French colonies and overseas départements in various parts of Africa, North Africa, West Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. So, France is often presented as a very racial or monolithic society, but it actually has long been extremely diverse. So even during the colonial period, it was very common for non-white individuals to migrate to France, either for temporary or permanent status. And so what we see now in present France is a reflection of that ongoing ethnic diversity, people coming and in more recent decades, settling, having children, having grandchildren from some of these overseas or former French colonies and overseas territories. The fact that Black and brown people in France are constructed as foreigner is a deliberate construction by the French media, by the French politicians, to make it seem or continually seem that France is a solely white society, or only recently has become a diverse society, and that just historically is not the case. So oftentimes when you see these images in the media of people protesting, etc., they are also French citizens, and part of what they're also protesting against is not being treated as French citizens, as their compatriots. But it's not a question of people who are legal foreigners. These are often predominantly French citizens themselves, people who are born and raised in France. And so I think that piece of the historical puzzle is often missing. France, in contrast to a few other societies, does not have what is termed "quote unquote" ethnic statistics, primarily based on the Republican model, but more recently, at least historically, is sort of thinking about, or sort of atoning for, if you will, the consequences of French involvement in mass deportation of Jews. During the Holocaust, excuse me. So, part of the ongoing fear, or very, very deep fear in France since that period, is a concern about the dangers, in quotation marks, of using statistics, of marking racial and ethnic differences for fear of the sort of negative and pernicious implications of doing so. And so this often comes up in present debates around ethnic statistics and why France doesn't have them. And there's still an ongoing debate both within French academia and just everyday French society about what might it mean for France to actually mark or have these kinds of data. Part of the one of the arguments for continuing with that practice is also thinking about the ways that France sees itself or tries to see itself as a very national cohesive society, and there's a fear that any sort of marking or official delineation of racial and ethnic categories would further serve to sort of divide French society. So it's really common, for example, for the United States to be framed as an example of what happens when you do that, when you do have that kind of data. But the flip side of that is that it makes it extremely difficult and challenging to do anti-racist work without data that demonstrates systematically that, just to give the example of police violence, that this is a racialized phenomenon, that there are more Black and brown victims who are targeted by heavily policing in particular communities, and there are more likely to be, stopped by the police, and then, oftentimes those interactions lead to death. But it's very hard to talk about that at a countrywide systematic level without that data. It's very hard to document that there's widespread housing discrimination against Black and brown people in France without that data. And so this has become sort of the this is the really, really tricky, challenging place that, anti-racist activists in particular in France are in, as they're trying to sort of, say that these are not kind of, the death of Nahel, for example, is not a one-off incident, but rather part of a larger structural phenomenon, because people don't really, frankly, just don't believe them without the actual data or the actual statistics.
I think most of it began with French colonialism. I guess it's got to do a lot with how the French police would kind of police women's clothing during the time. And if you read Fanon, you would know that during that time, women were policed in terms of their veil, in terms of their scarf, because there was this threat of violence from them. So I think there is an uninterrupted line of coloniality that has come into French politics after Algerian independence in 1962. And in terms of how they have adapted the entire system of laïcité, of secularism, what shouldn't be visible in the public sphere. And that visibility is, of course, if you're perceived Muslim, with dress, with henna, with halal food, with, whatever it could be, in terms of what the white French perceive as someone being Muslim. So that has come into, public discourse, because, of course, there has been a kind of hardening of the far-right stand on not getting Muslims in because of this cultural, religious, and, civilizational differences. So if you read even the term civilization, the way the French were using the civilizing mission was something that replaced policing of the indigenous populations of natives in Algeria, North Africa, and West Africa. And there's this fascinating work by Babacar Mbaye, who shows this line of how the French perceived their civilizing mission and what really happened. Not so much as in Christianizing them, but much more in terms of making the Muslim constituency completely separate so that the differences were visible, and hence they could, the French could go on with the conquest. So I guess there is a calculated disinterest from the larger public. Calculated disinterest, I would say, is because there is this idea that it's not happening to us. So if it is not happening to us, it doesn't interest us. But the word calculated here is really important, because it is not against us, it is serving us. So I don't know how much of that is in the subconscious of the people, or rather the unconscious, because the French love talking about psychology and the unconscious. How much of that is about the colonial unconscious of I am benefiting from it anyway, right? So I guess it takes a lot of courage to be like Fano and say, well, it will probably never happen to me, but it still is about human rights.
What some have termed political tensions in France, but what we know to be just reactions to unbearable, violent state racism, also led to mass riots. People were protesting their conditions, the systematic oppression that was just seeped into every aspect of French society, from employment to education, healthcare, political rhetoric, the constant weaponization by really politicians across the political spectrum in France. And all the issues that were raised following those riots have not gone away. For many, they've gotten worse, as the death count of particularly young Black and brown boys disproportionately who have been killed at the hands of state forces and within state services with no justice. I think also alongside that, there's strong growing anti-migrant both rhetoric and campaigns waged by multiple French governments. Again, some of the most significant moments to have come out of the period of the War on Terror has been the current Macron government's so-called fight against anti-separatism, which has seen a whole horde of Islamophobic, but just broadly hugely repressive policies come out, which, you know, are presented as security measures, but in reality have meant the total, effectively the criminalization of any kind of Muslim space, even identity, forms of representation. Anti-Islamophobia groups have been shut down, have been dissolved by the government. Mosques have been shut down. Dozens of mosques have been shut down. Any space in which Muslims could possibly come together, and bearing in mind their low socioeconomic level, where they could possibly come together to effectively address the many issues that plight them, from poverty to racism and xenophobia and so on, have been very aggressively attacked by the French government. But of course, this is extended beyond just the Muslim communities, which is exactly what Muslim activists and people of color who have been opposing and been vocal in France against all of these measures warned that it starts with the Muslims, that it expands beyond. And so what we're now seeing is environmentalists, journalists who have been opposing restrictions to their ability to kind of speak truth to power and to cover police brutality, in particular the filming of police, which the government introduced a bill in order to try and also criminalize, and so on. And so what we're seeing is just the continued, that depending on the catch of the day, whether it's Muslims, migrants, Black people, the government has rolled out very aggressively violent policies and waged campaigns in a bid to almost out far right the far right and maintain power. And also, we have to be honest, to kind of control opposition and repress any ability for people to come together, to rise up, to organize against their conditions, to demand better and to build a more equal society.
So the abaya ban is based on a law passed in 2004 in France that basically banned religious signs for students in schools. Until then, only religious signs for teachers were banned. But in 2004, they expanded that to students themselves. That was a controversial law at the time, but it passed. And it mainly targeted girls wearing hijabs. The text itself is supposedly neutral and targets all religions, but the text is born out of different controversies, public media controversies around cases of young hijabi girls trying to go to school or being ejected from school. But in the past 2 years, there's been this thing growing around the presence of women Arab women wearing abayas in schools. And so abaya is a type of clothing that is worn mostly by Arab girls, girls of color, and which can be associated to religion, but is not like a per se a religious garment, but it's been deemed so by the government, who banned them. And this has resulted in basically the harassment of a lot of schoolgirls who were wearing abayas, or not abayas, but that were girls of color wearing wide clothing, and that were told like you should wear something like that's closer to your body, you should wear a belt. So we saw this kind of mingling of racist and sexist policing of these girls' bodies coming hard at the schools and being legitimized by literal government measures.
So I think in understanding the question of race and ethnicity and religion in French society, we have to understand the role of French republicanism as an ideology, which, among other things, sees individuals as individuals and vis-a-vis or in relation to the state. And so one implication of that is French's, I guess the English version is secularism, and the closest English version is secularism, which is not sort of recognizing any marking or indication of religion in the public sphere. This is sort of why we often heard of lots of controversies around, Muslims wearing the hijab or other sort of typical Muslim dress or markers as being antithetical to the ideas of a French secular republic or a French Republican model. In practice, however, this is really not, this doesn't really play out the way that it states that it does, in the sense that oftentimes the sort of ideas of secularism or laicite are used predominantly against Muslims to sort of further other and discriminate against them. So part of the fact that, due to the fact that one cannot as easily openly discuss race and racism in France, often Muslims are deliberately constructed, across the political spectrum as a sort of, ethnicized or racialized other category. And the sort of, controversies or scandals around the burkini or the hijab are further sort of expressions of that animus towards these particular populations. Another way of saying that, or getting to the same point, is thinking about the fact that, even though France, again, posits this kind of, or professes a sort of secular model, they do recognize many Catholic and other Christian holidays as part of the sort of regular academic calendar, work calendar, et cetera. So it's even if you take out the question of Islam, which is hard to take out, there's still a lot of examples of the ways that France very deliberately marks particular religious demarcations, even in a sort of professed secular society.
There are 2 points to consider. One is this idea of covering and uncovering, and the state deciding, regulating women's clothes. There has been non-existent support from mainstream feminists, which is extremely concerning, which is, of course, in France, white feminists. And this intersection of race and religion, where race will trump gender, is quite visible there. So they would rather side with their own rather than think about gender, because, of course, white men have power. The second point is, this is not just about abaya. It is about being perceived as Muslim. There have been many cases where people have been asked to remove their kimonos because it looks like an abaya. And I would think of Sarah Ahmed here and have a tweak on Sarah Ahmed's phrasing. It is not the girl that matters, it's what she's wearing that matters, and who is wearing it. And that's the whole point here. Who is wearing it? If she is perceived as Muslim, then it is banned. She can't wear a kimono, she can't wear large clothes, boxy jackets. And second, it is not just the abaya, it's all the kameez, the thing that, the dress that men wear, that is also banned. So basically, I would say 2023 is a successful attempt at banning being Muslim. So visibly, you can't be Muslim anywhere. And it should be of concern to everyone working in human rights or social justice.
If we look at the recent presidential elections in France that have received a lot of attention, the far right, in particular the National Rally, formerly known as the Front National, the National Front, has consistently made it into the second round. And so that effectively means it got very far. It has to be treated as a mainstream party. This is not, this is not a party or political figures that are on the fringe. They are very much leading the national debate. And so what we saw in the run-up to those elections, during and even following the elections, is that so-called centrists or figures and parties loosely to the right have not only been matching the attacks on civil liberties, on racialized communities, on migrants, on the poor, even been accused of outdoing them. That the things they've attacked, from halal food to the visibility of Muslims, again, subjects that, in the rest of Europe would be considered to be strongly associated with the far right, are just very normalized within the daily campaigns of the current government and the previous one also, which is led by the same party under Emmanuel Macron.
One thing you're seeing in France right now, which I think is also present throughout much, if not all of Europe at present, is the sort of the consequences of a vast mainstreaming of far-right discourse and rhetoric. So, you're seeing President Macron often echo a lot of the same ideas and positions as, Marine Le Pen and other far-right politicians. So what's happened in France is that you no longer, quote unquote, need a far-right president, although I think that could still happen in France, because you already have a sort of overall acceptance or, widespread acceptance of a lot of the same ideas, such as, a general fear of Muslims, a general discourse that Black and brown individuals in France are not assimilating or, following the particular kind of Republican secular values, or they're just sort of separating themselves out from French society versus seeing themselves as part of French society. So a lot of these things that, otherwise might be, read as just views of the far right are actually very mainstream and very common. And I think in that sense, are common to hear. And so in that sense, I think what you're seeing in France in terms of the sort of heavy policing, the vast number of arrests, the increase in the number of incidents of police violence is only a reflection of this sort of broader context that we're seeing in France based on the reception of these ideals, which is, very scary, among other things.
During the 14th of July celebrations in France, which are major, we saw an honoring of Monde, who again is renowned for not just anti-Muslim rhetoric, but the violent treatment of Muslims in India. And so very much symbolized the broader international alliances that the French government is making with kind of fascist and far-right leaders globally in order to reinforce particular narratives around what the threat today looks like.
You see, we shout when we get happy. That's the way we Christians do. Oh, have you been tried in the fire?
I think what we need to do is look at the genealogy of French policing, police atrocities. So it's like a laboratory. So first on the Black and brown populations of France, and then onto the others. So I cannot deny that in contemporary times, especially in the 21st century, that the Yellow Vests, the Gilets jaunes protests were heavily repressed. Right, with deaths, with we know what happened with the use of flashball guns, the riot control guns, which are practically banned everywhere in the European Union, of which France is signatory. But of course, we need to go back to the police as an institution. The police as an institution, like in Britain, as Emmanuel Blanchard in the French case would say, was colonial in essence. So it was, it was the colonial disciplining and policing of native populations so that they don't revolt. The state apparatus, as Althusser would put it, as one of the state apparatuses. It emerged during the various civilizing missions so that, people were literally subdued, punished, and for imperial conquest. The whole idea was extracting resources and imperial conquest. We know what is happening in West Africa at the moment. We know in Burkina Faso and Niger what is happening, and the French response to it is poorly drafted, as I would say. So I think what really happened was this began with the conquest of Algeria in 1830s, and then there was this French police commissioner, Marechal Bugeaud, in Algeria, who was rewarded for conquering Algeria in the 1830s, and he set the template because it was the repression of the first Algerian War of Independence led by Abdel Kader, and those uprisings were suppressed, and then in the 1930s we had the same kind of repression for Muslim subjects in France. In 1961, on 17th of October 1961, the French commissioner ordered the deaths of various Algerians when they were thrown into the Seine River in Paris, right? So there is an uninterrupted line of police brutality, police violence against subjects of color, against French subjects of color, right? And which has continued even after 1961. I can cite so many cases only in the 21st century. I can cite so many cases. We can cite Adama Traoré, we can cite Nahel, we can cite Zaid and Bouna, adolescents who were in 2005, the uprising that happened because they died. So there is a pattern, and that pattern is most of these subjects are non-white.
So I think one of the most memorable events in the history of what some have termed political tensions in France, but what we know to be just reactions to unbearable, violent state racism, was in 2005, following the deaths of Zaid Bana and Bouna Traoré, who were chased by police and who feared for their lives and were actually electrocuted. And so the understandable rage that was sparked, particularly amongst poor brown and black communities in France, which these two boys stemmed from. They were both of African descent, also led to mass riots. People were protesting their conditions, the systematic oppression that was just seeped into every aspect of French society, from employment to education, healthcare, political rhetoric, the constant weaponization by really politicians across the political spectrum in France, and really all the issues that were raised following those riots have not gone away. For many, they've gotten worse.
In 2017, basically, the right to shoot of officers expanded. This was in part framed as a response to terrorist attacks. And basically, the right to shoot on a moving vehicle for police expanded. And we saw, because of that also, people attribute it largely because of the expansion of their right to shoot. There's been an increase in shooting and deadly shootings since 2017. And so in 2020, we saw for the first time, just like in the US and probably in the UK, white liberals joining with like racialized people in protests that happened in the center of the cities, and that were, I would say, quite positively covered by media in comparison to all the other discourse we might have had on racism and police killing, which is quite peculiar in France because a lot of the problems in France around talking about police violence is oftentimes, and very quickly, the discourse will bounce back to, oh, well, that's an American problem. It's not the same at all here. We don't have that issue. We don't have the issue of police racism. We don't have the issue of police violence. It's just like anecdotal. But in 2020, for the first time, we had in mainstream media, people thinking through the ways that actually French police might have also an issue of racism and racist police killings. And so it was a moment of unity that was quite peculiar, that I think a lot of countries experienced in the West at that time, that was kind of like optimistic, where we thought that maybe there could be an avenue or some space to have that discussion and give justice to all these killed young men. Nahel is like, he's a French Algerian young man, 17-year-old, who was killed in June 2023 by police during after a police stop, where he was threatened by police and threatened with a gun, and he drove away, didn't comply with that stop, and was shot at and killed. That even though it was not really obvious that he was posing a threat to people, but that's up to the courts to decide that in terms of the legality of the firing of that gun. And his killings sparked again renewed uprising against police violence and racism in France. It's a recurring theme, like in most Western countries that have issues of racism and police killings and racist police killings. Just like in the UK, just like in the US, every so often someone gets shot, often a Black or Arab young man. Last few times that that an uprising happened, it was often related to the release of a video, like we might have seen in other countries. But the uprisings of 2023 were like the last time we had a major uprising in recent history in France was 2020, in very recent history. Then we'd have to go back to 2005. But in 2020, after the killing of George Floyd, there was like sort of, it revived the issue in France, and there are ongoing cases for teens killed by police, Black and Arab teens, and the discourse around what happened in 2023, so around Nahel's killing, was very different from what we knew in 2020. In the first hours after the killing, there was a bit, like the video was released very quickly, so there was a moment where there was this floating judgment, but it wasn't the types of scenes that we saw in 2023 and 2005, where you have the demographics are very different. It's like young men of color, even though you did see that in 2020, but that was mixed with white liberals. But in 2023, it's mostly young boys, Arab and Black, from the suburbs, working class neighborhoods, that protest in like non-traditional way, let's say, set fire to things, loot, and so many people have labeled those types of protests as riots, and sort of, I mean, not always implying, sometimes very explicitly saying that these are not political in nature, it's just people rampaging. And so this calls for like a very law and order response. And some people have fought for the term used to be more like uprising, to try to highlight the fact that there is a political dimension to underage kids deciding to set fire to something or loot something, which is like kind of a unusual thing for a young person to do, and to do in such a way, in such organized ways, etc. So this is also the discussion that's happened around Nahel's killing.
What's ironic is that, again, on the world stage, France continues to present itself as this, as, you know, a republic that defends the freedoms and rights of all, and that they're a proud nation of protests and strikes and so on. But in practice, when the Macron government has been faced with that, whether it was the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, recently environmentalists again, or police brutality, that we've seen a very violent and aggressive reaction by the government to squash, to criminalize, to repress at any cost. And so eyes were pulled out by state forces that, you know, there was death, there was the violence reached, you know, levels that some would comment on by saying, you know, they wouldn't expect from a Western so-called civilized nation. And yet here was blood being spilled over people's rights to protest and to oppose their growingly difficult conditions.
Very quickly, there was a very strong law and order discourse. There was this idea that these were riots. They were not protests. So there is, since 2005, at the very least, a different type of policing between the suburb, Black and Arab population, and the center, which is usually richer and whiter, where we can recognize some kind of legitimate type of protest in the center, and like basically criminal activity in the suburbs. And so they are treated as criminals. And so since 2005, there's like this approach to these types of uprisings that is very criminal based. So it's going to be, the goal is going to be to go and arrest these kids who are setting fire to buildings and businesses. Except since 2005, there has been a slippage of that police approach towards the center, even though it's not fully like it is in the suburbs. But I would just want to underline that this distinction between the center and the suburb is slowly fading out. And we saw that, for example, during the Yellow Vest protest, or even before that, the labor law protest. There is a change, like what's happening in suburb is slowly affecting the core. But yeah, so what we saw in 2023, I mean, in this summer, what we saw this summer was heavy policing and an approach at those uprisings as criminal activity and repression of criminal activity. And so we saw mass arrests of minors who are getting like heavy sentences. We saw heavy police like also response, like brutality. Some people died. I think at least one person. I cannot remember the exact count right now. And there is one case that's very prominent right now of a teen that was caught in Marseille by a gang of, like a group of policemen that, I mean, if you look at what they did, it looks kind of like a gang in terms of like the violence that he was put under. He was severely beaten up, almost killed. He lost half of his skull from the severity of the beating. And so his case is ongoing, and his case happened it happened closely after Nahel's killing, because he was caught during the protests and beaten up, and the police who beat him were arrested and put in detention, and that also caused a lot of uproar among policemen. And you saw like a lot of policemen walk out of their job, like on sick leave, take a sick leave to protest against the detention of those police. So these are things that these trials are still ongoing, and Nahel's case is probably going to take years. Hedi, the guy who lost half of his skull, will also probably be in legal proceedings for a while.
When Macron attempted to shut down further protests following young Franco-Algerian Nahel's killing by a police officer, when there was an attempt to kind of shut down those protests and to shut down any kind of visible action that other family campaigns like Adama's had also joined and supported and so on, you'd see entire public debates where there wouldn't be a single person on the opposing side. It would very much be a very right-wing perspective around but these people are violent, and really ticking all the right kind of racist tropes around why this must happen, why these brown and black people should be treated with such aggression, why they must be shut down, and why they have nothing to complain about.
What I mean, I said this is what I mean. All my niggas got it, we unanimous. Cut from different cloth and different calibers. My skeleton is matching with my managers. She love me 'cause I'm handsome and I'm talented. Hanging off the banisters. Tell me who's gonna pay for all the damages. Oh, I'm just reckless like the man in me.